Anyone who has ever asked me about my program will know that I have a lot to say. Some of it is coherent, and some of it is jumbled in the form of thoughts that occupy my mind late at night and scribbled ideas in the margins of my notebooks. So I've thought a lot about how to start this talk in a way that makes sense. In the end, I decided to take a page out of the humanities book and just start from the beginning. I was a humanities student before I had any idea what that meant. Growing up, I read constantly. I'd read a book a day, rereading my favorites and taking out stacks of new books from the library every weekend. I'd bike almost an hour to get there, with a bag of returns and a whole row of holes waiting for me. But when it was time to think about university, I wanted to be practical. I wanted a career that would keep me learning, but one that would result in something steady, something meaningful. In my mind, that career was journalism. Though, if I had looked into it more, I would have read about the decline of print and all the doomsdayers bemoaning the lack of jobs in the field. But I didn't do that, so I ended up at Carleton with a second major in political science. I'd been told that that was what most journalism students did. I also took ethics and religion and psychology, classes that sounded interesting and diverse and smart. I didn't know what I was doing. I just wanted to learn. There's a moment I look back to as my first humanities moment. It was the first moment in university that I felt changed by something I'd learned, the first piece of information that sparked something in me, something more than just interest, something that now, 5 years later, I would call context. I had registered for a class on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I knew nothing about Judaism or Islam. I thought I knew everything about Christianity thanks to Dan Brown and the general small-town culture that I had grown up in. My family wasn't Christian, but I had always found Christianity interesting, and it was kind of everywhere. But in that class, it was Islam that I found surprising, challenging, and intriguing. I hadn't thought about Islam before. I had no idea what the religion stood for. There were no Muslim people where I came from. But as I continued to learn about Islam, I realized how similar it seemed to Christianity. And at the same time, I began to meet people who were Muslim. I began to read about Muslims in North America being attacked on the streets or online. I heard politicians talking about them, read Facebook commenters ranting about them, making false claims that even as a first-year student, I could now recognize as such. And I began to realize that many of those people were from towns like the ones that I had left. Towns full of churches and lacking in diversity. Towns where people weren't always given the chance to learn about other people, other cultures, or other religions. I wanted to change that. And that same year, I found out about the combined journalism and humanities degree. I had taken the humanities survey course, and I loved it more than anything else I had taken that year. I was reminded of all the things I had been interested in before university, such as religious history or Greek mythology, and I was struck by the dedication and enthusiasm with which the professors taught Plato and Boethius. When I found out about the combined honors degree, set to begin the following year, I decided to follow my instinct and switch in. I still didn't know to what extent the two programs would influence each other. In my mind, journalism would be my career, the sensible part of my degree that I'd take out into the world after graduation, and humanities would feed my curiosity, allow me to learn about the things that had always caught my interest, but that I hadn't thought of pursuing in university. I'm here to tell you how wrong I was. I had no idea that my education in the humanities and religion departments would be so integral to the development of my journalistic interests, nor that the skills I developed in the humanities program would so directly and foundationally affect me as a journalist. That one moment of context in a first-year religion class was just the beginning. But it wasn't until my penultimate year that I began to really see the links between the programs forming. Once I saw them everywhere. I saw them in the questions that came to my mind every time I met someone new and different. I saw them in the stories I wanted to write, stories I didn't see anyone around me pursuing. I saw them in the grand ideas that formed in my head about what journalism could accomplish if only someone would just go about it a bit differently. I saw those links in discussions about journalism ethics, public perceptions of journalists, questions of balance and bias. And with those connections, which deepened every time someone thought to question the usefulness of my degree, I began to try and write the stories I wanted to write. For example, that year I read Montaigne on religious toleration, and I thought about how religion intersects with public life today. Then I wrote an article about increased public attacks on Muslims in Canada. I also wrote about the effect of North American dating culture on how young Muslims today are finding relationships. And the whole time, I saw the humanities in my work. I tried to pinpoint what had changed, what made my approach different than that of many of my colleagues. I tried to find a way to explain what I felt was the perfect balance of history, eternal wisdom, and a field that I felt was in dire need of everything the humanities had to offer. I eventually boiled it all down to one word: Ironically, it's one of the simple questions we all hear listed in classrooms and lecture halls, along with who, what, where, and how. But I think the word why is the most important, and it best sums up what the humanities have brought to my journalism. In some ways, it has to do with the structure of the humanities program itself. It's a more or less chronological account of the history of ideas. I remember most vividly the second-year core course, which began with Plato's Republic and ended with Dante's Divine Comedy. It felt like a series of indoctrinations, each one just as convincing as the last, but with less staying power. Each thinker we were introduced to, it felt like they had the answer, the right theories, but then the next one would disagree or improve upon the past ideas, and the whole process would begin all over again. Over time, we became more critical, more aware of the context and of the temporality of dominant ideas. Now, when I'm introduced to a new thinker, the first thing I think is why. What are the factors that influence this person's views? Why do they agree or disagree with those before them? Now replace those thinkers with sources. When I'm interviewing someone and they make a statement that says something about their worldview, whether I agree or disagree or just don't understand, I ask why. Why do they believe this? Why is it important to them? How did their upbringing influence this opinion? This is especially relevant when dealing with stories about politics and minorities. Many journalists have tried, for example, to explore the reasons Donald Trump was elected president, and realized there was an enormous demographic that was being ignored in the United States. These people were often branded with isms and shoved to the side. But this approach clearly doesn't solve anything. What solves things is to ask why. Why do these people believe what they believe? Why did they vote the way they did? And why are they speaking out now? This same critical mechanism should be applied to statements about dominant worldviews. The phrase "because it's right" always raises red flags for me. Any argument based on what are believed to be the dominant ideologies begs the question, will this still stand in 10 years, 50 years, a century? Having watched the history of ideas play out, I know that what we see as our dominant ideologies today will be challenged and changed the way we challenged and changed the ones that came before us. In simpler terms, I'm just trying to tell you that humanities will make you think critically, be aware of context, and continue asking questions. These are all things that a journalist must do, and well. It's not enough to learn how to edit video, write a news hit, or interview a politician. Journalism is not just a job or a set of tasks to master. A journalist is a certain type of person, a person I believe the humanities helped me become.